Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking something absolutely fundamental. We're going to look at a remarkably elegant 2x2 matrix that will completely change how you view everything from your personal bank account to the very fabric of the cosmos. So, how do you actually build a comprehensive model of reality? It's a massive question, right? But whether we're talking about modeling economics, cosmology, or complex ecosystems, the secret isn't just looking at how systems behave in isolation. It's about understanding how they interact across vastly different scales. Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start by mapping reality's complex systems, then look at the pure, micro, and macro. After that, we'll explore the missing cross-scale loops, look at some real-world matrix applications, and finally wrap up with the cost of diagonal thinking.
All right, Section 1, Mapping Reality's Complex Systems, the blueprint.
So here it is, our foundational 2x2 matrix. Think of it as a blueprint for reality. On the vertical axis, we have the observer level. That's basically the lens we're looking through. And across the horizontal axis is the target level, what we're actually analyzing, whether that's the individual parts or the whole system. When you cross these, you get 4 critical combinations that map out how reality interacts. To truly grasp how any complex system works, you absolutely have to master how this matrix operates as one unified whole. Moving on to Section 2, the pure micro and macro, the on-diagonal extremes. Let's zoom in on that top left quadrant first. This is micro-micro, or constituent dynamics. We're talking pure reductionism here. This is where parts look at parts in complete isolation, ignoring the rest of the system entirely. Think of studying a single rational agent in economics, or zooming way in to look at the localized interactions of subatomic particles in quantum mechanics. It's incredibly valuable because it sets up our baseline mechanics. You literally cannot build the broader picture without first understanding these foundational pixels. Now dropping down to the bottom right quadrant, we hit macro-macro, and this brilliantly illustrates the exact opposite end of the spectrum. Here, the whole looks at the whole. It's pure holism and systemic laws operating entirely at the aggregate level. So in economics, you're looking at GDP or global trade flows. In physics, you're calculating the total mass energy density of the universe itself. It gives us that wide panoramic view and sets the high-level boundaries of the reality we're trying to model. But if we just stop there, we run into a massive problem. Look at physics, for example. We have quantum mechanics, pure micro-micro, sitting opposite general relativity, which is the macro-macro curvature of spacetime. This right here is the fundamental rift in modern physics. It's the ultimate example of getting stuck on the diagonal. By treating these two extremes as totally isolated domains, we end up with a fractured understanding, and we completely fail to unite continuous spacetime geometry with quantum fluctuations. Which brings us to Section 3, the missing cross-scale loops beyond the diagonal. Okay, let's look at the off-diagonal. The top right quadrant is micro-macro emergence. This is all about bottom-up causation. It analyzes how microscopic interactions scale upward to generate completely new macroscopic structures, things you could never predict just by looking at the parts alone. In economics, this explains how millions of individual, seemingly unrelated buying decisions suddenly aggregate into a massive financial bubble. Or in physics, how tiny quantum fluctuations in the early universe aggregated into the giant cosmic webs of galaxies we see today. It perfectly captures how the macro world is quite literally constructed from the micro world. Then we shift to the bottom left quadrant, macro-micro or top-down constraint. This looks at how an overarching environment or system retroactively dictates the behavior of its individual micro-components. Think about cosmology. The global expansion of the universe actively redshifts individual localized photons. Or back to economics. A central bank raises macroeconomic interest rates, right? Well, that top-down pressure immediately alters your personal micro-level spending habits. The whole is always pushing back down on the parts. So what does this all mean? The absolutely crucial point here is that reality is a continuous bidirectional feedback loop. The parts seamlessly construct the whole, while the whole simultaneously governs the parts. To understand any complex system, you have to master this loop. Section 4, Real-World Matrix Applications, Stress Testing the Framework. Now, what's really interesting is how this applies to everyday life, like personal finance. It maps perfectly to our 4 quadrants. If you only obsess over the micro, like, say, agonizing over cutting a $15 streaming subscription while totally ignoring your overall earning potential, you miss the big picture. Wealth building requires micro-macro emergence, where investing just $500 a month compounds into millions over time. But wait, you also have to survive macro-micro, top-down constraints, like high inflation squeezing your daily budget. And you manage the whole shebang with a macro-macro panoramic view, like maintaining an 80-20 equity to bond split. Personal finance literally requires mastering all four. We see the exact same architecture in human health. The micro-micro examines a single mutated gene, like TP53, in complete isolation. But disease itself is often micro-macro emergence, localized cellular inflammation scaling up over time into systemic heart failure. And don't forget the macro-micro loop. Overarching psychological stress from your environment can retroactively suppress your micro-level immune cells. Meanwhile, at the macro-macro level, public health officials are tracking global pandemic propagation rates completely independent of individual cell mechanics. Systemic health relies heavily on all these scales interacting. You can even apply this to governance and public policy. Sure, you have your micro-micro local zoning and neighborhood compliance, but the real game changers are often found in those cross-scale loops. In the micro-macro quadrant, uncoordinated choices by millions of people can suddenly coalesce into massive grassroots movements, like the rapid adoption of green energy. Conversely, in the macro-micro quadrant, state-level tax codes push down to deliberately shape individual corporate and citizen incentives. Honestly, the best macro-level national strategies will completely fail if they ignore how they push back down on everyday citizens. Which brings us to our final section, Part 5. The cost of diagonal thinking, failure modes. The danger of ignoring these off-diagonal loops is universal across almost any field. In medicine, treating symptoms with microdrugs while completely ignoring macro lifestyle causes, that's a diagonal failure. In finance, meticulously tracking every micropenny can get entirely wiped out by macro inflation if your overall asset allocation was ignored. And in governance, passing massive blanket macro laws often creates terrible, perverse incentive structures for individuals on the ground, simply because policymakers completely ignored that macro-micro feedback loop. Classical economics is perhaps the most glaring failure mode of all here. By over-relying on macro-macro aggregate models, economists tend to treat whole populations as a single, uniform, rational agent. By ignoring the micro-macro emergence loop, they completely miss how small pockets of micro-irrationality can suddenly cascade into massive market crashes. And by ignoring the macro-micro top-down constraints, they obscure how sudden monetary policy shifts create painful, uneven distortions at the ground level, often disproportionately penalizing lower-income households. Which leaves us with this final thought. We've seen exactly how this 2x2 framework maps the mechanics of reality, from quantum physics to your personal budget. The parts construct the whole, and the whole governs the parts. So if the world truly relies on these continuous cross-scale loops, what parts of your own life are you only viewing diagonally? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I hope you start applying this matrix to everything you see.